This is Karen with NewClevelandRadio.net, and it is time for Avoid the Maze. And my guest today is Ann Roberts. And I may not have met Ann in my lifetime, except for the fact that through podcasting, I make a lot of connections. And I got an email that said, "Would you like to talk to Ann about a book that she wrote?" And I looked at it and I said, "Oh my gosh, this came to me for a reason because it's about the autism spectrum." And if you're out there and you don't know anything about autism, I hope by the time you hear the two of us talk, not just about our book, but the things that we have gone through, you will start to understand that autism looks different. It's not the same. Although I think Ann and I have a lot of things in common. So, welcome, Ann, to Avoid the Maze.
Thank you, Karen. It's so nice to be here. I appreciate your time and the fabulous introduction to this amazing, mysterious world of autism. Thank you.
So, as I started to tell you offline, my son was diagnosed when he was 6 years old. That was 1996. We had no idea he was on the spectrum, although there were certain things that he did that made me go running to his pediatrician and asking questions, like when he was 18 months old, sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth, banging his head on the floor. Doctor said, one of these days, he'll say it hurts, he'll stop doing it. And he did, but then he picked up something else. He loved baseball. So as a 2-year-old, he'd walk around making batting swishes. And again, we thought it was cute. He loved baseball. There was nothing wrong with that. He didn't like loud noises. Nobody told us that this could have anything to do with autism. Knocking his head on the floor, making these batting sounds, now not liking loud music and sounds. But he was a friendly little boy. He had more friends than I've ever had in my life. But then one day, he was in preschool and his teacher thought there was something wrong. Didn't tell us what it was, reported it to the school psychologist. They came in, they examined him, and then we got a phone call. "We believe your son is autistic. Go see a doctor." In 1996, I believe the numbers were like 1 out of 150 were being diagnosed. And Ann, you just told me today's numbers are 1 out of 54?
Correct. Yep.
So how did you get into this life of being a parent of somebody on the spectrum?
Well, Karen, it's a great question. I actually am not the parent of somebody on the spectrum. However, in my later years, in my 30s, which is late to find a career, I went to school, and one of my courses I had to take just for an education degree was in special ed. And to make a very long story short, I fell in love with the teacher. And I blindly, not ever preparing to be a teacher, I thought it would just open up doors in publishing, I became a special needs teacher for adolescents between the ages of 16 and 22. I used to drive home and say to myself, I can't believe I get paid to do this. It was an instant match. Something about me connected to them. There is plenty to say about that, but in my 15th year of teaching, I took a parent, because they were 16 to 22, my job was to not only help them with life skills, but to transition them into adult services and hopefully work. One day, on just an ordinary day, on an ordinary car ride, I happened to take one of the mothers to see a place I thought her son Edward would really resonate with. And I asked, because he was such a character, I asked, how is it that Edward learned as a young person? And for the next 20 minutes, she told me the backstory of her taking home her son, who was born with Down syndrome. Those doctors that delivered him said, leave him right here. He will be institutionalized. You go on about your life. And she did the unthinkable and took him home. She taught him everything. How did I become interested in people? I think I've always been curious, but when I had students, it was a special needs classroom. I had students of all varieties, from accidents to Down syndrome to Prader-Willi to various terms.
Sure.
And what I found fascinating was, there's a great line by somebody who said, if you enter a room with special ed kids, you immediately know that they're special ed kids. After 5 minutes, you have no idea. And that's what I found, the harmony among them, and my ability to realize it's in me. Sometimes the disconnects, all those things that you and I talked about before this podcast, which are human behaviors that I have, that also they have. And so because I've had more education, and because of maybe my previous life, I was able to find the compassion for that, and to together, truthfully, in many instances, walk with them through some of these things. But to your point, Karen, yeah. I'm not sure if you wanted to continue on that, but here's a list of, when I was writing this book, of things I thought, and I bet we've all come to draw our own conclusions about what autism is. And so I had a list. It got longer as I interviewed mothers, of characteristics. And then through the stories, I found that people did them. But here's what I really found, is that anxiety, for example, that's pretty much across the spectrum.
Right.
But we all have a certain amount of anxiety.
Exactly.
And if I say to you, this one person is very anxious, well, I know plenty of people who are very anxious. So it is a spectrum of abilities and disabilities. I will stop there, because I'm sure you have a different line of questioning.
I love that you said that, because in our society, we love to label. And it's so easy to label somebody, because if you do that, then you think, well, now I know them. But the reality of it is, the label does not identify who that person is.
Absolutely.
So before we came online, Ann and I were talking about my son, and I said, 99% of the time, people have no idea he's on the spectrum. Does he get anxious? Yes. So do I. And I haven't been identified as being on the spectrum. Does he get into his own head? Yes. He's so intellectual that he feeds off what his brain is telling him, and his brain is firing very, very quickly.
Yes.
And to some degree, I'm OCD, so I can understand that. But I also have just a little bit more control than he does.
Yes.
But that doesn't make it, any different that he has a label, I don't have a label. Mm-hmm. But by having that label, the outside world wants to pigeonhole him. Mm-hmm. And just like the mother who you interviewed, whose child was born with Down syndrome in the 70s, and a doctor to say, hey, leave your child here, go on with your life. I don't know too many mothers who can really do that. I don't know too many fathers who can really do that. This is your flesh and blood. Is it easy to take that child home and educate them and incorporate them? No. But I don't think my mother had it easy with my brothers and myself, and none of us had those labels or those conditions that she had to tend with. So life isn't easy for any of us.
Right. And her trick was to say to her other son and daughter, as well as to the world at large, we're going to treat him like everybody else. And that's how she pulled it off. She read to him every single night, not just baby stories. She read series again and again, the Hardy Boys, you name it. He became kind of an actor. He knew lines. He loved characters. He just had such a personality. He is so alive to this day. So yeah. And the other thing about your point of your characteristics and that you have more control over them, that is key, that we can see this coming on. I mean, when I'm cleaning the same thing for the fifth time, it's time to stop.
Right.
That's
Yep.
the thing they might not have. And that's about it, that they don't have the stop. Yeah.
So, when you decided to write this book, obviously you had been working as a special ed instructor. You were falling in love with your students because a good special ed instructor tends to fall in love with their students. Um, so, what made you decide that, hey, it's time to put this in writing and talk about individual stories?
Great question. I probably should have clarified that I vowed at the time I heard that backstory from Hazel that I would write that book and that story, not knowing where it was going to go. And it took me maybe 7 years before I retired, took care of parents, and then remembered that story and went back to her and asked if she'd repeat it. And then other mothers just came forward and wanted to be part of that. So my first book was called Five Courageous Mothers Raising Children with Down Syndrome. And the publisher that put it out about a year later said, Anne, what about autism? I mean, autism is so predominant. And by the way, your son in the 90s was born in what other parents have told me is the surge
Right.
of autism. And it was absolutely phenomenal, the numbers. And we can discuss that, but I don't know if anybody knows for sure. But at any rate, so I thought about other students in my classrooms and their mothers and friends of mine who are raising children with autism. And I thought, everybody knows somebody with autism.
Right.
But what I wanted to clarify I was a teacher for almost 21 years. What I wanted to clarify for so many people is just what you've been talking about. They are like snowflakes. There's no two of them that are the same. And if this book just shows that, I will be happy. So I asked one of the mothers that I taught her son, and as a matter of fact, she had a son and a daughter on the spectrum, and that's how it began. And again, I was led to these remarkable mothers, remarkable women. Women are just amazing to me. And when the publisher asked me to do this book, I said, Henry, his name is, I really don't want you to publicize this as being the book on autism because it's just too big and I don't know if I can do it. And he said, we'll call it Across the Spectrum. So the book covers various types of autism, and they don't label it anymore, but in my classroom there were labels, and so I had to read up on that. But what it shows is the snowflake theory, if you will, about people like your son, who is just brilliant. But everybody has their own kind of instincts and desires, and to follow those is key. Yeah.
And, sometimes the family gets lost in the shuffle. And I'm sure, some of your mothers talked to you about that. So, something that happened to me when my son was, probably about 9 years old, 3 years into his diagnosis, he still had some friends because it was elementary school. And so, um, all kids at 9 years old have oddities about them. So, maybe he didn't look as different, but he had a friend and he wanted to get together with this boy all the time. And I finally called the mother and I said, I understand that Alex and your son are friends. Can we meet for coffee? And maybe we can schedule something. She kept putting me off. And then finally she said, okay, I'll go to coffee with you, but I only have a half hour.
Mm.
And I thought, okay, I was taking time off of work. She was a stay at home mom. So I met her for coffee. And the first thing she said to me was, Karen, if it weren't for our boys being on the spectrum, I wouldn't have chosen you to be my friend. And I just sat there and it was like, well, this wasn't about the two of us becoming friends. It was about letting the boys play together. And I said, is there something you know about me that you don't like? And she said, no, I just don't want to be friends with other autism parents.
Mm. Oh,
And I said, but I want to be friends with as many people as I can be. And she said, you know what? This is over. We never even talked about the boys getting together. And that has resonated with me because for almost 10 years after that, even though I'd be involved in school activities, I was always the parent who was busy doing something,
mm.
but I wasn't communicating with the other parents because I didn't want somebody to say that to me.
Yeah.
And I didn't want them to identify that my identity was based on a label that somebody had given my son. Because as I said, he was more than that label.
You know, bravo for saying that. I don't think you're alone. And here's my reason for saying that. These mothers, one of the things I felt interviewing them, I spent 10 sessions with each parent and taped them and transcribed them and then wrote the stories. But what I heard is that these stories are buried, are tucked
Yes.
deep inside, unlike the mothers with Down syndrome. And you can guess why people with Down syndrome have a look about them. So when we did the group photo for these pictures, it was the first time these mothers, and not all of them were students' mothers,
Okay.
Mothers of my students rather, they didn't know each other. And they came together for this group photo with their son and daughter. Yeah, and they didn't stay long. They left. So I said, something's funny here. I didn't understand it, truthfully. So I said, come next week for lunch. Let's build on that photo shoot. And they came, and I sensed that I better have place settings far apart. Isn't that weird?
Yeah.
It's the first time I'm saying this story, and afterwards I asked one of the mothers, what is it, do you think, that you didn't really, I had to draw out of them the stories so that I could connect them at the table. And eventually they started blabbering. But it was not going to be, this was not going to happen unless somebody was drawing it out of them. I asked one of the mothers at the end of that lunch, what do you suppose that is? And she said, Anne, I was always embarrassed. Now, I said, Jackie, seriously, your son is like superstar. And he is, he's Asperger's, he very bright, has a job, went to college, he actually has a son, he's married. And she said, but how about those younger days when I would take him to see people? And as you talked about that one incident that would just shatter people so that they didn't know where to go.
Right.
That was embarrassment. And I learned from all those mothers that it was those embarrassing times, as they didn't understand it, that made them feel isolated. And that's what I'm picking up from you. And that's,
Oh, absolutely.
that is the so too bad part of this, because, you know, one of the mothers who actually helped write the introduction, she vowed when this son was born, she would never, ever have to do anything with him other than keep him home. And you know that at age 7, she had to put him into a home. She's still crippled by that decision. And she said, you know, what mothers forget is that we have to trust our gut.
Absolutely.
And because you are so judged, you're looked at, even taking my students to stores, if somebody had a meltdown or if somebody was off, it was me they looked at.
Right. Yeah. Why aren't you taking care of that? Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
And I know all mothers have been through that. I mean, even mothers of supposed neurotypical mothers, everybody's been through that. But they don't quite understand the control, there's that word again, that is needed to adjust that behavior.
Exactly. And, you mentioned that when my son was diagnosed in the 90s, there was a big surge, and there was. But sadly, for the first 10 years, so from 6 to 16, the treatments were all sort of like canned treatments. We're going to give you this medication, and you're
Oh,
going to go to ABA therapy, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do that. And one of the things I'll never forget my son telling us, I think he was 7 or 8, we had walked out of a therapy session, and the therapist had come up with, you're going to have this little jar, okay? And in that jar, you're going to put in the things that you like, and you're going to have this jar, and you're going to put in things that you don't like. And that way, you don't have to yell and scream about it. Mom and dad can look in the jars and figure it out. And he's going, oh, yeah, good idea. Oh, I can't wait to go home and get my jars. We get in the car and he goes, I ain't doing jars. And my husband turned around and he said, but you just told her you would. He said, it's stupid. And we said, well, is that a good word to use? I don't care. And he got really angry with us. And so I said, okay, I didn't force him to do it. If he's not going to do it, why am I going to create another battle? So we didn't do it. And 2 weeks later, we go back to therapy, and she says something to him about it. And he just looks at me. He's not going to talk. And so I tell her what happened. And she goes, you should have made him do it. I said, are you going to come live in my house
yeah.
and have these jars? I said, and they would have had to been unbreakable, because if I really had glass jars, he would have broken them. And I said, but if he's not going to follow through, or he's not going to follow through in a comforting way that he learned something,
Yeah.
why do it?
Yeah.
And that was the conundrum that we had for the first 10 years, is that everybody, and I would hear it from other parents. Yeah, my son was told to go home and make jars. My child was told, it was like, this, is it working for your child? That's wonderful. The same way, if I want to go on a diet, first of all, I have to train my brain to know what to eat and what not to eat. And that's basically what my son finally told us when he was 16. He said, you kept telling me what to do. Did you ask me? And we didn't. So, these kids who are born on the spectrum, one of the things we have found out right from the beginning, most of them are brilliant, at least in one area, if not many.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's those affinities, right, that might seem strange, or they're normal, but he just does it too many times.
Right.
And can't we look at trees for a change? No, we can't right now.
Yeah.
I have goosebumps thinking of that. Like Ron Suskind, who I'm sure you know the movie Life Animated, where
Yes.
he could not bear another Disney movie in the house. He had locked it, and he finally got on his knees, pulled out one of Owen's puppets, and just by chance started to talk in the language of one of the Disney characters. Owen tragically had lost his language when he was 3, but he understood everything that was happening in Disney. And the minute that hand came up on the bed, he was able to talk back to it.
Yep.
The benefit of going and following those affinities not only brought his language back, but Owen is a fabulous young adult right now with a job.
And I'm so glad that you're bringing this out about some of the ones that you've interviewed, and that just because they may have struggled when they were younger,
yes,
doesn't mean that they're going to be the same as they get older. I remember my son's neurologist, who I do believe is on the spectrum himself. Love him to death. He has a son on the spectrum. And but one thing he said to us very off the cuff, you'll notice a change when Alex is 25.
Yes.
And I looked at him and I said, this, I think he was 11 when he told us, and then when he was 16, and when he was 18, and when he had to, move him out of his practice when he was 21, he reminded us you only have 4 more years. And I kept saying, how can you put this on a timeline? What is going to happen? And yet, just around his 25th birthday, he started to bloom. He
Yeah.
started to see things a little more clearly. He was able to then go back. And one of the things he did, which we didn't know for almost a year, he was throwing his medication out. He wasn't even taking it. And that's about the time that he started doing so much better. His head wasn't cloudy. He
Yes.
wasn't being pushed in the wrong directions. He didn't have a mom or a dad saying every night, did you take your meds?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the fact that he chose and he did it in a way that he could do it without us noticing made a huge change.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
Not everybody is going to have that type of behavior change. But the people who are listening, especially the parents, we need each other. We
Yes.
need to talk to each other.
Yes.
We cannot be alone.
And that is what, again, the woman who helped with the introduction said, that it was too painful to be in a group. And I've noticed even with the first book that came out, people who are raising children with special needs of whatever sort, they're in it. They're in the trenches, so to speak. And it is too difficult. One of the stories I wrote in this book has a woman whose speech therapist said, please come to this high school graduation. You'll see how amazing this Patrick might be. And she couldn't imagine much high school when her son was 3 or 4, much less even going to kindergarten. She was just, so yes, big changes can happen all the time. And I love that your son was smart enough to know he didn't need this. Yeah, that's a phenomenal story.
And there are times, that he'll say, okay, I need a little assistance.
Yes.
And,
yes.
We now have learned to say, okay, it's your choice. If you want our input, it's here, but you are an adult. And, sometimes it's hard, to let our children be adults because we remember what happened when they were 4 years old and 8 years old and all the way through.
And we don't want to go back there. And another story of I don't know if you're going to get to this, but, if there's people listening who have girls on the spectrum, it's a pretty different process.
Yes.
And one mother told me her daughter was diagnosed so late. She went through school and teachers, while well-intentioned, were pushing her into these very difficult social, emotional things to the point where she almost went mute. So her mother went to her neurologist and they wanted to put her on medication. They couldn't really figure it out. She still didn't have a diagnosis. And her brother had the diagnosis, not her. So when she finally got to high school, she said to her mother, similar to your son, maybe I will try that medication, because she so wanted to fit in, and actually started the medication and did wonders in high school. And now too is a receptionist. She, answers the phone, buzzes people into the office, tells them where to go. But she too has put the medicine aside. So you don't know. Again, it's trust your own gut and watch your children and listen to what they're saying, because they know.
And, I have seen the difference between females and males on the spectrum. And especially early on when we look at those little boys and we say, oh, they're just active. Oh, that's okay. or, oh, she's such a quiet little princess.
Yeah.
That's okay. So my niece had twins, and my son looked, he was older than them, and these were his special babies. And,
Oh,
um, we'd go up to Michigan to visit them, and he just like, when he was with them, when he was like 7, 8, 9 years old, he really had the maturity of a 21-year-old.
wow.
He
Mm,
really communicate with them.
mm,
But then she found out they were both on the spectrum. And my son, like, could watch the two of them from a distance, and he would call up my niece and say, look at, Wiley needs this, try it. And she'd try it, and then she'd call me and she'd go, how did Alex know? I said, because they're on the same wavelength to some degree.
yeah.
That may not be Alex's personality, but he sees it. Okay. And then her daughter was the quiet one. And Alex kept saying, please get her diagnosed. He said, I really think
Mm,
she's on the spectrum. And it's amazing how these two have just grown into wonderful,
mm,
educated human beings. But at the time that they were diagnosed, they were totally opposites. And yet
wow.
they both had the same sort of condition. And that's why I say to people, you know, yeah, we put a label on it for the insurance companies.
Hmm.
Sometimes we put a label on it for to make sure that they can get the right education in the school system.
Hmm.
But we don't have to look at them every day as
Yes.
oddities.
Yes. Yeah. And one of the doctors, in the same time frame that your son was born, this woman had a son too, and the doctor told her he didn't want a label because he was so bright that he didn't want teachers and other people interacting with him to have less of expectations. So there's some positive benefits for not being labeled, but some of the problems, with autism is that it's often misdiagnosed for a long time, at least in these stories and in my own experience of students. They're labeled with other things, like,
Right.
and hyperactivity is one of them for sure. Um, and it is later that the problem is they don't get the teaching that they need, but the teaching has improved as the needs have come too. So
Exactly.
it's still so young. We don't know causes. We don't know. We can speculate, but we don't know. And so we're learning. And I just hope that we continue to do that, but also continue to understand the similarities between you and me and a group of other people with autism.
Well, and for the adults out there, it's not going to be unusual to possibly find out in your 50s or 60s that you're on the spectrum. Uh,
Yes.
my husband did find that out. Um, and his mother was like almost relieved because she always used to say he marches to the beat of a different drummer. And uh, you know, I didn't notice any real oddities in him when I met him. Um, and after we were together, yeah, there were a few, but I know I have my own. So again,
Exactly.
never connected it. But as our son started going through puberty, we started noticing more in my husband because the two of them were almost competing against each other.
Mm,
Dad wanted his son to be here and his son wanted his dad to be there. And instead, they were like knocking heads. And thank God for a wonderful neurologist who said to my husband, I want you to take a couple tests. He said, it's not going to change what you do or how you do it, but it's going to help you understand why you do things. And my husband was so grateful because he was about ready to go back to school for graduate work. And he was finding as he was preparing that it was very difficult for him to learn online because everybody told him, you're working full time, you got to do it online. And he just couldn't.
uh,
And he started reading into it and realized that he needed that one on one with
mhm,
somebody.
mhm,
And even though he had struggled through his undergraduate degree, his graduate degree, I mean, he soared through it. And even the doctor said the way you were taught back then was totally different.
Yeah.
It wasn't the way you needed to learn.
Yes.
And so, you know, all these things, I don't know if they're environmental that's causing it. I don't think it matters. Whatever
Mhm.
is causing it, but we can work through it. And it's
Yes.
people like you who care enough to bring families together
Mm.
who can share their stories.
Yes. It's been such a privilege for them. I appreciate it more each day. And as I get ready to launch this book, I think of it a lot, that because these stories were so deep inside, that their purpose was to just expand people's awareness of how different people with autism are. That simple, that profound, right? But to your point about aging, what I love is that there are more books out there. There's a fabulous book, and I can't pull the name of it, but he's an author who wrote about his own life. And when he was in his 50s, well into business, successful, he too was diagnosed with autism and wrote, looking back at his life, all the places that he saw where the hinges just didn't meet. And I found it fascinating to read, but I thought for anybody who's, again, 1 out of 54 of us have the label, are diagnosed with this ASD, but there's plenty more of us that are
Absolutely.
still out there. So we are interacting with them at the grocery store, at the hairdresser, wherever we're going. And it's so important to just be aware. And I always used to say this, even with people with special needs that you knew were special needs. If you just introduce yourself, you're going to find something that resonates coming back, because it's not common, and you will open their world but more importantly, you'll open your world. It's
Well,
such a truism.
I interviewed a gentleman, about 2 months ago, who has been in acting most of his life and producing. And he had an accident in his adult life, and he's wheelchair bound. And yet he's, doing everything that he wants to do. And one of the things he brought up to me was when he's out and about and parents are with their kids and the little kids stare, trying to figure out what's going on, parents pull their kids away. And
Mm.
his big
Mm.
thing was, stop doing that.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay for your child to say, why are you in that chair?
Yes.
Or what happened to your arm? Or, you know, why do you talk that way? Because
Right.
they need to learn. They need to know that it is okay
Yes. Yes.
to be this way. And
Yes.
I didn't really, I never thought of it that way because growing up, um, disabled individuals or people with special needs, they weren't out and about as they
Mm-hmm.
are today.
Right.
And so, the only person I ever think I saw in a wheelchair was my grandmother after she had a heart attack being wheeled to her car. Okay. And so that to me was a wheelchair, not seeing somebody going to the grocery store or
Yeah.
anything else.
Yeah.
And I realized I missed out on a lot growing up because I didn't understand it.
Yeah.
But now that we can integrate with each other, it's okay to ask those
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah.
Um, and my son for years was out there, giving talks at the schools and sometimes even acting a little goofy. So he could say, yeah, when I do this, people want to know, am I acting goofy or is that part of me? And he would say, sometimes it's really part of me,
Yeah.
you know? And
Yes.
and the kids in the classroom would get all excited because, you know what, I do that too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it? And as you were talking, it's reminding me of children, period, that when they see people that are disabled or even in school, they tend to have this nurturing, this kind of compassion in a young age. And then there's something around the 9, 10, 11-year-olds that separates, and people are, terribly mean. That's true in real life,
Yep.
right?
Ab-
But not to make it sound all very common, because it's very, very painful. Then there is the education that people get again as they get older. And that's the whole point. The more that we are accepting of each other. I mean, look at LGBT. I mean, we've come miles in so many areas. This is just one more area that we are missing out on if we don't take a peek in and introduce ourselves to it. Yeah. And the second thing I just was reminded of in writing this book, your husband and your path of finding out that he too has a label. And one of the mothers literally said one day when she said, you know what, I think my husband's on the spectrum. And he was told the same thing. It's not going to change anything. And it doesn't. As you said, there's reasons for the labels going through school. And, you know, there's people who are recovering alcoholics who say it somewhat, not proudly, but they say it when they need to, for it to be in situations that they're not partying. So I hope we get to a level like that where it's just common understanding. It's just another person next to me.
Well,
But
and you know, once my husband was diagnosed, it made me relate to him sometimes better, because
yeah,
it would be like, so my husband loves to tease, okay? He's always been that way. But being on the spectrum, sometimes that teasing, it's repeated, repeated, repeated,
mm,
repeated. And there's some days I just have to like shut it out and
yeah,
say, it's okay, this isn't bothering me. There are other days when it does bother me, and I have to say, can we sit down for a minute? This is what I'm hearing. So I'm not necessarily saying, you know, you're a bad guy for doing this,
yeah,
but he
yeah,
he may not even recognize it. He'll
yes,
go, oh, well, you know, I'm not trying to annoy you. And I said, I know that, but I have to let you know it is. And so the two of us need to work on it.
yeah,
That to me is the big thing that can come out of the awareness,
yes,
especially the parents with their kids, you know, like when my son was walking around, you know, swapping like he had a baseball bat, you know, I can't tell you how many times I would say, don't do that, you're going to break something.
yeah,
What I should have been doing is moving the things that he could have break. But at the time,
mm,
I wasn't there, and I was trying to control a behavior that he needed
yeah.
badly.
Beautiful story. Beautiful story. One of the mothers, I remember her saying her son at like 1 was at the um, high chair, and he had a bucket where he could pour out the numbers, and he would line them up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and he was looking for another 1 to make 11, and he couldn't find it. And her husband said, oh, he's going to be fabulous. You know, Einstein didn't learn to speak until he was such and such an age. He's going to be a mathematician. I know it. They went to visit a relative, and the relative's daughter was a nurse, and she saw these numbers line up. And in her gut, again, I go back to trust your instinct. She said to this nurse as he was lining up the numbers, because she didn't want to see it one more time. She knew this was not Einstein. She knew. And the nurse said back to her, it is a little odd. I would get it checked out. Again, open up communication to see whether your gut is correct. And there's no shame in having this diagnosis. It's just you're going to learn to deal with it differently. Yeah.
So when does your book come out? Tell us a little bit about the launch.
The launch. The launch is next Thursday. And because of COVID, we're doing it on a lawn, a big sweeping lawn, which will be great. Hopefully the rain will stay away, but the sun will stay out. So it's taken me almost 3 years to write this book. Some of it was delayed. I had a medical issue for about 5 months, but then I got back into it. So the editing took some time, but it's been a process whereby I couldn't wait to get up in the morning to do it. So it helped me to get through COVID. It kept me on almost a spiritual path. It really has been a light of my life to to hopefully find the right words and to continue to remember the intention. And the intention is awareness. It's just awareness, as well as just a shout out to moms, to all moms. I think women are amazing. I have goosebumps just saying it. I really think that people that take their job seriously are, they deserve the red hearts we see everywhere. So I'm thrilled for them. I can't wait because, again, we've all held secrets, and this is just a big exposure. So yeah, I have a generous publisher who is going to make it a night of fun, not necessarily as pizzazz, but it will have, not entertainment, food and chairs, and we will have just a knockout time. Yeah.
And then tell us the name of the book and where will we be able to get it?
Thank you, Karen. The name of the book is Across the Spectrum, Mothers of Autistic Children Speak. And it is available at omni-pub.com. And eventually it will be on Amazon. It probably will be simultaneously on Amazon, starting on the 24th, I believe.
Well, number one, I want to encourage all parents, prospective parents, grandparents, even parents of fur babies. I think you need to read the book. I haven't read the book, but just knowing some of the information that is probably there, it's probably the stuff that is still stuck in my gut. As Anne said, it's all about awareness. And if we can just be one step ahead of the curve, so much beautiful can happen in our lives. The more I podcast, the more I share my story, the more I realize that, even though I may not have done things all correctly in the past, I'm learning.
Yes.
And what I'm learning allows me to grow. And I'm hoping that if we just touch one person today,
that's right.
We've come a long way.
As one woman said to me, just because I've lived it doesn't mean I know it.
Yeah.
There's always so much to learn. I mean, I did 20 years of teaching, and I learned so much from these mothers and their directives for me. They're a way of looking at people that only enhance the way I live my life. So it is something where we are headed in the right direction. I really do believe it.
That is wonderful. Do you have another book inside of you?
That's to be decided. I definitely will take a break. It is a process, and it's you definitely need to have glue so that you stay at your seat. Yeah.
Yes, I do understand that. I have a lot of friends who are writers, and every time I ask them, is there another one coming out? There's one up here, but you know what? It just hasn't come to the heart yet. So until it comes to the heart,
yes,
wait in line.
Well, in fact, that's a great end, because when Henry asked me to do this book, I said, Henry, I don't know if I have the same passion that I had to write this book. And he said, well, you can always try it and see. So I dipped my toe in, and honest to goodness, it wasn't, I don't think it was an hour later that I knew that I was on fire. I was on fire just to learn. Maybe I'm always been hungry. I know I've always been curious, but the learning, it just expands me so that I can be useful to others.
Well, we will put all this information to the show notes. So for those of you listening, if you say, I didn't catch where I can get the book, I don't remember the name of the book, just look at the show notes and copy them and paste them and send it off to all your friends. And Anne, we wish you the best of luck, and thanks for sharing today.
Thank you so much, Karen. Wonderful to talk with you.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye now.